With one final document, Caryn Chandler thought she had won it all: the farm, the money, the legacy. What she didn't know is that Amy Roloff had already written the last page of the story a decade ago. The scene was set for the ultimate coronation, the final act in a long and bitter war for the soul of the Roloff family. Caryn, the ever-present partner, the loyal confidant, was about to be crowned the undisputed queen of the empire. Matt Roloff's final will and testament was her victory decree, the legal instrument that would finally erase Amy's influence and dispossess the very children who were born on that land. But in the cold, quiet room where legacies are read, a ghost from the past was about to speak, and it held a contract that would turn a coronation into a catastrophe. The final chapter wasn't about a will, it was about a promise, a secret pact made in the fires of divorce, a masterstroke of foresight that would prove Amy Roloff was always playing chess while everyone else was just playing checkers. This is the story you have all been waiting for, the definitive conclusion to the saga of Little People, Big World. The information we are about to share is based on insider reports and exclusive theories pieced together from sources close to the family. If you want to be the first to hear every shocking detail of this final showdown, make sure you press that like button, subscribe to Lpbw Update, and ring that notification bell. You are not going to want to miss a single word of this. The day of the will reading dawned gray and somber, a fitting backdrop for the end of an era. The air inside the prestigious Portland law firm's conference room was thick with a toxic cocktail of grief, resentment, and barely concealed anticipation. Seated around the polished mahogany table were the fractured remnants of the Roloff family. Zach and Tori, their faces etched with a weary resignation, had prepared for this blow for years. Jeremy and Audrey, ever the optimists, still clung to a sliver of hope that their father wouldn't deal them the ultimate betrayal. Molly and Jacob were there too, silent sentinels to their family's implosion, their expressions unreadable, but their presence a heavy weight in the room. Across from them sat Caryn Chandler. She was the picture of dignified sorrow, dressed in tasteful black, a single tear dabbed delicately from her eye with a pristine handkerchief. But her grief was a performance, a meticulously crafted facade. Behind the veil of mourning, her mind was buzzing with the triumphant hum of victory. Today, she would be validated. Today, all her years of service, of managing Matt, of sidelining his ex-wife and children would pay off. The farm, the sprawling, iconic, multi-million-dollar Roloff Farms would be hers. The legacy, the brand, the fortune, all of it. She had played the long game, and she had won. And then there was Amy Roloff. She sat slightly apart from her children, a silent, composed figure. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't wringing her hands. There was a stillness about her, a calm that was deeply unsettling to anyone who noticed. Caryn, in a fleeting glance, dismissed it as shock, the final acceptance of her utter and complete defeat. It was a fatal miscalculation. Amy wasn't in shock. She was waiting. She was the grand strategist, patiently waiting for the enemy to walk into a trap she had set a decade prior. The estate lawyer, a man named Mr. Albright, cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He adjusted his glasses and unfolded the document that held the power to rewrite their lives. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice a monotonous drone, "to read the final will and testament of Matthew James Roloff. The spoke of Matt's final wishes, his love for his family, the standard legal preamble that felt like a cruel joke in a room so devoid of love. The children braced themselves, then came the hammer blow. Mr. Albright's voice was clear and emotionless as he read the dispositive provisions. "To my children, Zachary, Jeremy, Molly, and Jacob, I leave my love and my hope that they find their own way in the world. I have provided for them throughout their lives, and I am confident in their ability to succeed independently. It was a cold, clinical dismissal, a verbal pat on the head while the knife was being slid between their ribs. The children flinched as if physically struck. Zach's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing in his cheek. Tori reached for his hand under the table. And then the coronation. As for the entirety of my remaining estate, the lawyer read on, including all real and personal property, all shares and interests in Roloff Farms, LLC, the Roloff Company, and all associated business entities, and the entirety of my financial accounts, investments, and personal fortune, I bequeath without reservation or condition to my devoted partner and companion, Caryn Chandler. The words hung in the air, sucking the oxygen from the room. It was done. He had actually done it. He had disinherited them all, completely, utterly. The farm, their home, their birthright, the land their hands had helped build, was now the sole property of the woman they all blamed for tearing their family apart. Caryn's performance was masterful. A gasp, a hand flying to her chest in feigned shock. "Oh, Matt," she whispered, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. "I had no idea." But her eyes, for a split second, betrayed her. They glittered with a cold, hard triumph. She looked across the table at Amy and the children, and in that fleeting glance was a message of absolute dominance. Checkmate, I win. The foundational lie that had brought them to this moment was one Matt had repeated like a mantra for years, a narrative that Caryn had nurtured and weaponized, that Matt had the unilateral right to give the farm to whomever he wanted. "I bought Amy out," he would thunder in interviews and on the show. "It's my farm now. My name is on the deed." This declaration became his justification, his shield against the accusations that he was robbing his children of their legacy. Our insider reports suggest this was more than just a belief of Matt's. It was a carefully cultivated strategy orchestrated by Caryn. For years, she allegedly worked to isolate Matt from his children, framing their desires to be part of the farm's future, not as a continuation of a legacy, but as a greedy cash grab. They're entitled, sources claim she would tell him. They don't appreciate what you've built. They just want a handout. This narrative reached its zenith during the failed negotiations with Zach and Jeremy. She positioned herself as the protector of Matt's legacy, the only one who truly understood his vision. She convinced him that his sons weren't worthy, that their offers were insulting, that they didn't have the grit to run the farm as he had. The lie was insidious because it was wrapped in the language of paternal disappointment. It allowed Matt to reframe his own selfishness as a difficult but necessary business decision, a father teaching his sons a hard lesson about the real world. But it was always a lie, a foundational, rotten lie that ignored a truth so profound, so legally binding, that it had been waiting dormant for a decade. The truth was that the farm wasn't just Matt's to give. It was a marital asset, forged over 30 years of shared struggle, sacrifice, and partnership with Amy. And Amy, in her quiet, often underestimated way, had never forgotten that. She had foreseen a day just like this one, a day when Matt's judgment, clouded by illness and influenced by another, might lead him to make the ultimate irreversible mistake. Back in the lawyer's office, the air was thick with the fallout of the will's reading. Zach was on his feet, his face a mask of fury. "This is a joke," he seethed, his voice trembling with rage. "After everything, after all the promises, he gives it all to her?" Jeremy simply shook his head, a look of profound, soul-deep disappointment on his face. Audrey was trying to comfort him, but her own eyes were filled with tears of disbelief. Caryn, meanwhile, was accepting condolences from Mr. Albright, playing the part of the surprised but gracious inheritor. "I'll do my best to honor his memory," she said, her voice dripping with false humility. "I'll take care of the farm. It's what he would have wanted." She was already envisioning her future. The new sign at the entrance, Roloff Farms, Caryn Chandler, proprietor. The family photos in the big house replaced with her own. The final, complete erasure of Amy Roloff. All eyes eventually turned to Amy. Her children looked at her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and a sliver of desperate hope. Surely she wouldn't take this lying down. Surely she had something to say. Caryn watched her, a smirk playing at the corners of her lips, daring her to make a scene, to rage, to cry. It would only make her victory sweeter. But Amy did none of those things. She met the gaze of her children, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod of reassurance. Then she turned her attention not to Caryn, not to the fuming Zach, but to her own lawyer, a quiet, unassuming woman named Miss Davis, who had been sitting silently beside her throughout the entire proceeding. Amy looked at Miss Davis and gave a single, deliberate nod. It was a signal. The game was not over. The Queen was about to make her move. This moment of quiet composure was the culmination of a decade of strategic patience. To understand its power, we have to go back to the darkest days of the Roloff divorce. Exclusive theories, based on a deep dive into the family's history, suggest that the final negotiations were brutal. Matt, eager to start his new life with Caryn, wanted a quick and clean break. He offered a buyout for Amy's half of the farm, a deal that was publicly framed as generous. He just wanted it over with. But Amy held firm on one particular point. It wasn't about more money or different assets. It was about the future. It was about legacy. Sources close to the negotiations at the time whispered that Amy had a profound and specific fear. She had watched Caryn's influence over Matt grow from that of an employee to that of a partner. She saw how easily Matt could be swayed, how his perception of his own children could be colored by an outside voice. She had a chilling premonition of a future where Matt, perhaps in his later years, could be convinced to cut the children out entirely. She insisted on a private addendum to the divorce decree. A secret clause. Matt, according to these reports, initially balked. He saw it as Amy trying to control him from beyond the legal finality of their divorce. He accused her of being bitter and untrusting, but Amy was immovable. This was her one non-negotiable term. For her, it was a matter of principle, a safeguard for the children she had raised on that farm. The clause was brilliantly simple and legally ironclad. It would later be known as the Legacy Protection Addendum. Eager to finalize the divorce and move on, and likely underestimating the legal teeth of what he considered a sentimental, toothless request from his emotional ex-wife, Matt signed it. He probably put it out of his mind the moment the ink was dry, dismissing it as one last piece of Amy drama he had to endure. He signed it, the divorce was finalized, and he moved forward with his life, building his new world with Caryn, all the while oblivious to the legal time bomb he had just armed. Amy, for her part, took her signed and notarized copy, placed it in a secure bank vault, and waited. For 10 long years, she waited for a day she hoped would never come. Now, that day had arrived. In the conference room, Ms. Davis, Amy's lawyer, responded to her client's nod. She calmly opened her own briefcase and produced a single sealed document. It was bound in a simple blue legal cover, looking almost quaint next to the thick, formal document of Matt's will. "Mr. Albright," she said, her voice cutting through the tension with professional precision. "Before your client, Miss Chandler, begins celebrating her inheritance, there is another legal document that requires this room's attention." Caryn's head snapped towards her. "What are you talking about?" "The will is final. Matt's wishes are clear." Miss Davis ignored her, placing the document on the center of the mahogany table. "This," she announced, is the Legacy Protection Addendum to the marital settlement agreement between Matthew Roloff and Amy Roloff, dated and notarized on May 28, 2016. A confused silence fell over the room. Matt's lawyer, Mr. Albright, looked bewildered. He had drafted the will based on the assets Matt claimed to own outright. He had never been made aware of any such addendum. The children stared at the document, a flicker of understanding beginning to dawn in their eyes. This was their mother's move. "This is ridiculous," Caryn scoffed, her voice a little too loud, a little too shrill. "Some old piece of paper from the divorce? That has no bearing on Matt's final will. He bought her out. The farm was his to do with as he pleased." "On the contrary, Miss Chandler," Miss Davis replied, her tone icy. "This old piece of paper has every bearing on today's events. In fact, it supersedes the primary clause of the will you just heard read. It renders it legally null and void." She carefully untied the ribbon on the blue cover and flattened the document for all to see. The pages were aged, but the signatures at the bottom were clear. Matthew J. Roloff, Amy J. Roloff, and below them, the raised embossed seal of a notary public. It was the smoking gun. Miss Davis cleared her throat and began to read the critical clause, her voice ringing with the unassailable authority of contract law. Clause 4B, designated the inheritance clause, states the following: "In the event that either party, Matthew Roloff or Amy Roloff, bequeaths their respective share of the marital assets, specifically and including all parcels of land and business entities associated with Roloff Farms, in a manner that fully and completely disinherits one or more of their shared biological children, Zachary, Jeremy, Molly, or Jacob Roloff, the act of such a bequest shall trigger this clause." She paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. Caryn's face had gone from smug to confused to pale with dawning horror. Miss Davis continued, her voice steady and deliberate. "Upon the activation of this clause, the entirety of the bequeathing party's share of the aforementioned original marital assets shall not pass to the named heir in the will. Instead, said share of assets shall automatically revert, effective immediately, to a pre-established irrevocable trust known as the Roloff Children's Legacy Trust, the sole beneficiaries of which are Zachary, Jeremy, Molly, and Jacob Roloff in equal shares, and the trustees of which are to be appointed by a majority vote of the said beneficiaries." Checkmate. The room erupted. Caryn was on her feet, her face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage and disbelief. "No, that's not possible. He would have told me. This is a forgery. It's a trick." But it wasn't a trick. It was a masterstroke. Matt's final act of betrayal against his children was the very thing that had activated their salvation. By attempting to give everything to Caryn, he had, by the unassailable power of a contract he himself had signed, legally given it all back to his children. His will, the document Caryn saw as her crown, was nothing more than the trigger for Amy's hidden trap. The farm, the business, the entire fortune built during their marriage, it was all snatched from Caryn's grasp at the very moment of her victory. It now belonged to the Roloff Children's Legacy Trust. It belonged to them. The shock on the children's faces was slowly being replaced by a staggering, unbelievable wave of relief and vindication. They looked at their mother, truly seeing her for the first time in years, not as the woman who had sold her part of the farm, but as the woman who had found a way to save it. She had played the longest game of all, absorbing years of criticism and misunderstanding, all while holding the ultimate trump card in reserve. But the bombshells were not finished dropping. As Caryn and her lawyer began sputtering about legal challenges and contesting the validity of the addendum, another, even more damning piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. A piece that would expose Caryn not just as a greedy beneficiary, but as a malicious actor who had willfully ignored a direct warning. A stunning new development has just reached us, an exclusive and report from a source deep within the Portland legal community. The estate lawyer who drafted Matt's final will, Mr. Albright, has come forward. It appears his professional conscience and perhaps his desire to protect his legal practice from any blowback has compelled him to provide a sworn statement to Amy's legal team. This statement is the final nail in Caryn's coffin. According to this bombshell affidavit, during a planning meeting for the will, Mr. Albright explicitly raised a red flag. As a matter of standard due diligence, he asked Matt a critical question. Are there any pre-existing contracts, marital settlement agreements, or other legally binding documents that could encumber these assets or supersede the terms of this will? It was a routine question, but in this context, it was everything. The sworn statement details that Matt, his memory likely faded by time, and his focus on his new life seemed unsure, but it was Caryn who was present, and it was Caryn who answered. According to the lawyer's sworn testimony, she dismissed the concern out of hand. She allegedly waved her hand and laughed, a small, condescending laugh. The affidavit quotes her as saying something to the precise effect of, "Oh, don't worry about that. Amy isn't smart enough to have done something like that. Let that sink in. Amy isn't smart enough." This single sentence is the internal betrayal twist that changes everything. It proves Caryn's willful ignorance and malicious intent. She wasn't just an unknowing party to Matt's decision. She was an active participant who, when presented with a potential legal obstacle, chose to rely on her own arrogant underestimation of Amy rather than to investigate the truth. She heard the warning, a direct advisement from a legal professional, and she consciously and contemptuously dismissed it. This testimony demolishes any legal standing she might have had to challenge the addendum. She can no longer claim to be an innocent, surprised beneficiary. The lawyer's statement proves she was made aware of the potential for a pre-existing contract to exist and chose to ignore it, driven by her hubris and her belief in Amy's intellectual inferiority. It paints a picture of a manipulator so confident in her control over Matt and so dismissive of his ex-wife that she walked blindly into the very trap she was warned might exist. The legal battle to come was no longer just about contract law. It was now colored by Caryn's proven bad faith. Amy's foresight was one half of the equation. Caryn's arrogance was the other. Together, they sealed her fate, leaving her exposed, disarmed, and on the verge of losing everything she had fought so ruthlessly to obtain. The checkmate had been declared, and now the entire board was about to be swept clean. The revelation of Mr. Albright. Albright's affidavit landed in the silent conference room with the force of a physical explosion. The legal document, the Legacy Protection Addendum, had been the cannonball that breached Caryn Chandler's fortress walls. But the lawyer's sworn testimony was the gunpowder that ignited within, threatening to bring the entire structure down on her head. Her carefully constructed facade of the grieving, surprised inheritor didn't just crack. It vaporized. What was left was raw, primal, and stripped of all pretense. "He's lying," she shrieked, her voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the room's tense quiet. She whirled on the estate lawyer, her finger jabbing at him like a weapon. "You're lying to protect yourself. You're in on this with her." Mr. Albright, a man accustomed to the decorum of corporate law, physically recoiled, his face pale. He looked at Miss Davis, Amy's lawyer, with an expression that pleaded for professional solidarity against an unhinged client. Caryn's eyes, wild and frantic, darted from face to face, seeking an ally, a flicker of doubt she could exploit. But she found none. The children were staring, not at her, but at their mother, their expression shifting from shock to a profound, dawning comprehension. It was Zach whose face told the whole story. The rage he had felt for his father moments before had been a hot, explosive fire. But this new emotion was something different. It was a slow, rising tide of awe. He looked at his mom, this woman he had so often seen as passive, as someone who had simply given up and walked away, and he was seeing her for the first time as the warrior she had secretly always been. She hadn't surrendered. She had executed the most patient, strategic retreat in family history, repositioning her forces for a final, decisive battle she knew would one day come. Amy remained an island of calm in the hurricane of Caryn's meltdown. She didn't engage with the shrieking accusations. She didn't gloat or smile. Her work was done. The trap had been sprung. Now, all that was left was to watch the predator thrash in the snare it had been too arrogant to see. Her silence was more damning than any accusation she could have leveled. It was the silence of irrefutable victory. Caryn, realizing she was losing the room, turned her legal team, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "We fight this. We fight this with everything. This is a sham, a last-ditch, pathetic attempt by a bitter ex-wife to steal what is rightfully mine. Matt wanted me to have the farm. His will is his final word." Her lawyer, a shark from a downtown firm who clearly relished a fight, nodded grimly. "We will file an immediate injunction to contest the validity of this addendum," he said, the word dripping with disdain. "We will challenge its authenticity, the circumstances of its signing, and its applicability against a legally executed final testament." But Amy's lawyer, Miss Davis, was already a step ahead. "You are welcome to try," she said, her voice cool and cutting. "But you should know my client was meticulous. The addendum was not only signed and notarized, but its signing was also witnessed by two independent parties, both of whom are still alive and have already provided sworn affidavits testifying to Matt Roloff's clear state of mind and uncoerced signature. Furthermore, the notary public who stamped the document has had his license continuously for 30 years and keeps impeccable records. We already have a certified copy of his journal entry from that day. We have run forensic analysis on the ink and the paper. The document is, to use a legal term, unimpeachable." She let that hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final crushing blow. And as for the will superseding the contract, any first-year law student could tell you that a prior, legally binding contract governing the disposition of specific assets takes precedence over a subsequent testamentary wish. You cannot will away something you have already contractually promised elsewhere. Matt Roloff's will is not nullified in its entirety. Ms. Chandler is still entitled to his personal assets not tied to the original marital estate. But regarding the farm and its associated businesses, the will is nothing more than a piece of paper that pulled a trigger on a contract he signed 10 years ago. A contract, she added, looking directly at Caryn, that Mr. Albright, by his own sworn testimony, gave you every opportunity to investigate. The battle lines were drawn, but one side was armed with a nuclear deterrent, while the other was holding a pocket knife. The ensuing legal war, which Caryn initiated with a fury born of desperation, was not the epic courtroom drama she had envisioned. It was a slow, methodical, and humiliating dismantling of her every claim. Our exclusive insider reports from the legal proceedings paint a grim picture for Caryn. Her team's first motion was to challenge the addendum as a forgery. This claim collapsed within weeks. The forensic report came back as a perfect match to known signatures of Matt and Amy from that era. The notary public, a respected elderly gentleman, gave a deposition in which he clearly recalled the meeting, noting in his log that it was an unusual inheritance clause, but perfectly legal. The two witnesses, a former business manager for the Roloffs and a neutral legal aide, corroborated every detail. The forgery claim was so baseless that the judge reportedly warned Caryn's lawyers about filing frivolous motions. Next, they tried to argue that Matt was under duress, coerced by Amy into signing away his future rights just to escape the marriage. This argument was even weaker. Ms. Davis's team produced emails and records from the divorce negotiations showing that it was Matt who was relentlessly pushing for a swift conclusion. He was the one eager to sign whatever was necessary to finalize the divorce and move on with his new life. The narrative that Amy had somehow overpowered him and forced his hand was, in the words of one legal analyst we spoke to, utterly laughable. The core of Caryn's case rested on the idea that the will, being Matt's final and most recent wish, should hold the most weight. This was her moral argument as much as her legal one. "He loved me. He wanted me to have his legacy," she was heard to have said during a deposition. But the law is not concerned with love or final wishes when they conflict with the cold, hard print of a contract. The judge, in a preliminary hearing, made the court's position brutally clear. A person's right to dispose of their property by will is not absolute. It is subject to any prior contracts or agreements they have entered into. Mr. Roloff made a contractual promise to his ex-wife and his children. His will did not erase that promise. It activated its consequences. The most humiliating part of the proceedings for Caryn was her deposition regarding Mr. Albright's warning. Under oath, she was forced to confront his sworn statement. Ms. Davis was relentless. "Ms. Chandler, were you present at the will planning meeting on August 14th of last year?" "Yes." "And did Mr. Albright, as a matter of due diligence, ask Mr. Roloff about any pre-existing contracts with his ex-wife?" Caryn tried to deflect, to claim she couldn't recall the specifics, that it was a stressful time. But Ms. Davis produced the lawyer's own detailed, time-stamped notes from the meeting. "Let me refresh your memory, Ms. Chandler. According to Mr. Albright's notes, which he is prepared to testify to under oath, you were the one who responded. You told him, and I quote, 'Amy isn't smart enough to have done something like that.' Do you deny saying those words, Ms. Chandler?" Faced with a direct question under penalty of perjury, with the lawyer who heard her say it sitting across the room, Caryn crumbled. "I may have said something to that effect," she mumbled. "It was an off-the-cuff remark." An off-the-cuff remark, Ms. Davis pressed on, her voice like steel, that dismissed a direct legal warning, a remark that reveals your belief that your entire claim to this multi-million-dollar estate was secured because you believed Amy Roloff to be your intellectual inferior. Is that correct? The legal battle dragged on for months, a slow-motion car crash fueled by Caryn's refusal to accept defeat. With every motion denied, with every piece of evidence presented, her position grew weaker and her legal bills grew higher. And where was that money coming from? It was coming from the personal assets Matt had left her. His 401k, his stock portfolio, his personal bank accounts. In a tragic irony, she was spending the very money Matt had given her, in a futile attempt to seize the legacy he had unwittingly protected from her. While Caryn was bleeding money in the courtroom, the Roloff children were making moves. The first order of business was to formalize the Roloff Children's Legacy Trust. They gathered not in a lawyer's office, but around the worn wooden table in the original farmhouse, the very heart of the legacy they had just reclaimed. The atmosphere, for the first time in years, was not one of tension or resentment, but of shared purpose. They were no longer fractured individuals fighting for their father's approval. They were a unit, bound by a shared inheritance and the stunning revelation of their mother's quiet strength. Zach, pragmatic and grounded, was elected the initial chairman of the trustees. Jeremy, ever the dreamer with an eye for aesthetics and brand identity, took charge of the farm's public-facing image. Molly, with her sharp, organized mind, volunteered to oversee the trust's finances and legal compliance. And Jacob, the family's moral compass, insisted that their first principle would be to manage the farm ethically and with respect for the land and its history. Their first official act as a board of trustees was unanimous, and it was brutal. They drafted a formal notice of no trespass addressed to Caryn L. Chandler. It legally barred her from setting foot on any parcel of land owned by the trust, which now included the entire 100-plus acres of Roloff Farms. There would be no transition period, no graceful exit. It was a clean, sharp amputation. The serving of this order is a moment that sources say will go down in Roloff family lore. Caryn, still legally residing in the new house Matt had built, drove up to the main farm gate one afternoon, likely to survey what she still believed would soon be hers. She was met not by a friendly farmhand, but by a sheriff's deputy. And standing just behind the deputy, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone, was Zach. The deputy politely handed her the papers. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon, but the message was simple and clear. Get out and stay out. She looked past the officer at her former stepson, her face a storm of fury and pleading. Zach, you can't do this. This is my home. Matt would have wanted... Matt's will triggered a contract, Zach interrupted, his voice devoid of emotion. That contract put the trust in charge, and the trust does not recognize your right to be here. The farm belongs to his children now, as was always intended. There was no further argument. The presence of law enforcement made it clear this was not a negotiation. Defeated, humiliated, she was forced to reverse her car and drive away from the gates of the empire she had so nearly conquered. She was locked out. The queen had been deposed and exiled from her own would-be kingdom. The children's next move was a deep dive into the farm's finances from the past decade. With Molly leading the charge, they initiated a full forensic audit. What they uncovered, according to reports, was a pattern of spending and financial decisions that deeply troubled them. Projects that seemed to benefit Caryn personally, expenditures that didn't align with the farm's core business, and a general entanglement of personal and corporate funds that suggested Caryn's influence went far beyond that of a simple partner. This financial audit solidified their resolve. They weren't just taking back their legacy, they were, in their view, rescuing it from years of mismanagement and self-serving influence. The final act of Caryn's legal saga came not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating thud of a judge's gavel. Her lawyers, seeing the writing on the wall, had tried to argue for a settlement. But the children, on the advice of Ms. Davis and with the full support of Amy, refused. This was not about money. It was about principle. It was about legacy. They would accept nothing less than total victory. And total victory is what they got. The judge, seeing no tribal issue of fact, granted Ms. Davis's motion for summary judgment. This meant there would be no dramatic trial, no jury, no chance for Caryn to spin a sympathetic tale. The case was over before it truly began. The judge's written ruling was a legal vivisection of Caryn's claims. He affirmed the absolute validity of the Legacy Protection Addendum. He cited contract law precedents stretching back over a century, and in a particularly scathing final paragraph, he addressed the issue of willful ignorance, directly referencing Mr. Albright's affidavit. The defendant, he wrote, was presented with a clear warning by competent legal counsel. She chose to ignore this warning, relying instead on a dismissive and, frankly, insulting assessment of the other party's intelligence. She cannot now claim surprise or ask the court to protect her from the consequences of her own hubris. It was a complete and total checkmate. Caryn Chandler was left with Matt's personal assets. It was a substantial sum, certainly enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. She was a millionaire, but it was a hollow, bitter prize. She had not fought for comfort. She had fought for an empire. She had fought for the name, the land, the legacy, the public status of being Mrs. Roloff in all but name, the undisputed mistress of the farm. And all of that had been taken from her. She had the money, but she had none of the power, none of the prestige, none of the victory she craved. The aftermath created a new reality. Roloff Farms is now managed by the Roloff Children's Legacy Trust. The sign at the entrance remains, but its meaning has been restored. It is once again a family enterprise, a legacy being passed down through generations. Reports suggest the children are working together, navigating the complex dynamics of their shared responsibility, but united in their purpose. They have begun to heal the fractures, not by forgetting the past, but by taking control of their future. And Amy Roloff, the grand strategist, has her ultimate vindication. She is not the owner of the farm, nor does she want to be. Her victory was never about reclaiming the land for herself. It was about preserving it for them. She is now the respected family matriarch, a frequent and welcome visitor. She watches her grandchildren play in the pumpkin patch, the same patch where she raised her own children, secure in the knowledge that the land beneath their feet is theirs, protected by a promise she had the foresight to demand and the patience to enforce. Her legacy is not in the ownership of property, but in the brilliant, loving act of foresight that secured her children's birthright. She is the quiet queen who checkmated the usurper, not to take the throne herself, but to return it to the rightful heirs. Amy's foresight secured her children's legacy and was the final move in a decade-long chess game. Was this the most brilliant, satisfying ending possible to this epic saga? Let me know your final thoughts on the entire story below.